My wife and daughter treated me like a guest who'd overstayed his welcome, except in my own home. For 6 weeks, they smiled through me, talked around me, and scheduled the most important moments of our family's life without bothering to tell me. So I stopped being available. Not in anger, in clarity. 3 years later, my daughter called me at 6 in the morning, crying. She needed me at her graduation. What she didn't know was that I'd been watching her grow up from a distance, quietly making sure she'd be okay whether or not she ever picked up the phone. My name is Webb. I'm 51 years old, and I spent the better part of 2 decades building commercial real estate developments across the Pacific Northwest. Not the glamorous kind you see in magazine spreads, the kind that actually works. Warehouses that become distribution centers, old textile mills turned into mixed-use communities. I built things designed to last, structures engineered around the understanding that the foundation has to be stronger than everything sitting on top of it. My wife Sandra understood that about buildings. She never understood it about people. We'd been married 22 years when things started dissolving, not with a fight or a revelation, but with silence. The particular silence of people who've decided you're not worth the conversation anymore. It started in January, the year our daughter Kayla got accepted to the University of Washington School of Law. I was proud enough to embarrass myself, told every contractor and property manager I worked with, sent a handwritten card to her dorm. Sandra threw a dinner party to celebrate. I found out about it 2 days after it happened, when one of Sandra's friends mentioned it at the grocery store. I thought it was a scheduling mistake. I told myself Sandra must have assumed I knew. I let it go. February brought Kayla home for a weekend visit to look at apartments near campus. They toured 4 units together. I didn't know she was in town until Sunday evening when I heard her voice in the kitchen. She hugged me, asked about work, then disappeared back into the conversation she'd been having with her mother before I interrupted it. By March, I'd started noticing the pattern. Calls between Sandra and Kayla that went quiet when I walked into the room. Dinner reservations made and kept without a mention. A trip to Portland to look at furniture for Kayla's new apartment, documented in 50-something photos on Sandra's phone that I only saw because her screen lit up while she was in the shower. I wasn't angry yet. I was confused in the specific way that takes a long time to become something harder. April was when I understood. Kayla had left her laptop open on the kitchen island while she charged her phone in the living room. I wasn't looking for anything. I was making coffee, half asleep at 7 in the morning, and the screen lit up with a notification from a group chat called Just the Two of Us with a heart emoji. The preview showed my name. I stood there for a moment, mug in hand. I've never been the kind of person who digs through other people's phones or reads private messages. But I've also spent 20 years in an industry where ignoring warning signals kills projects and costs people their savings. I know what a structural warning looks like. I tapped the screen. The chat went back 4 months. Most of it was ordinary restaurant recommendations, links to law review articles, photos of apartment listings. Then I found myself. Kayla had written, in December, Dad asked about Thanksgiving again. Sandra's response, just tell him we're keeping it small this year. He'll find something to do. Kayla, is it bad that I just don't want to deal with his questions the whole time? Sandra, not at all. He makes everything about logistics. You don't need that energy right now. I scrolled further. March. Kayla, he's talking about coming to move-in day. He wants to help with the furniture assembly. Sandra, tell him parking is impossible near campus. He'll back off. Kayla, already done. Worked perfectly. Sandra, he never pushes when you give him a logistical reason. Use that. He thinks practically, so just speak his language. Lol. The lol landed somewhere behind my sternum and stayed there. I scrolled to the most recent messages from the week before. Kayla, do you think we should tell him about the brunch with Professor Ellison? Sandra, why would we? He doesn't know her. He'll just sit there, asking about the structural integrity of the university cafeteria or whatever. Kayla sent a string of laughing emojis. Sandra continued, he means well, but you know how he gets. Just the two of us is better anyway. That's kind of become our thing. I put the laptop back exactly as I'd found it. Walked upstairs. Sat on the edge of the bed in the room where I'd slept for 22 years and understood, with the calm that comes after the noise stops, that I had not been forgotten accidentally. I had been deliberately set aside. The way you set aside furniture that no longer fits the room you're trying to create. I wasn't hurt. I was done. The process I started that morning took 8 weeks. I was methodical about it in the same way I'm methodical about every project. which is to say I did not rush a single step and I did not tell anyone what I was doing. Week 1, I called Philip Okafor, my attorney and one of the few people I trusted completely. I outlined what I wanted. He asked no unnecessary questions and gave me a timeline. We met 3 times at his office downtown. Sandra thought I was at a job site. Week 2, I restructured the ownership stake I held in Coastal Meridian Development, the firm I'd co-founded 18 years earlier with a college friend named Derek. My shares transferred quietly into a family trust I'd actually set up 4 years earlier, not for this moment, but because I'd learned from watching other developers what happened when a man's professional life had no protection from his personal life, had no protection from his personal one. The trust had 2 beneficiaries. One was Kayla, with conditions. The other was a young man named Owen, my son from a relationship that ended before Sandra and I ever met, who lived in Boise and worked in renewable energy consulting, and who had been part of my life in a private and consistent way for 15 years. Sandra didn't know Owen existed. She'd never asked about my life before her. I'd offered, early in our relationship, and she'd waved it off. Ancient history, she'd said. I only care about now. I'd taken her at her word. Now I understood that she only cared about the version of now she was building. Week 4, I stopped my direct deposit into the joint checking account, opened a separate account, moved my consulting income accordingly, left Sandra's half of every shared expense covered, nothing more, nothing less. Week 6, I signed a 6-month lease on a furnished apartment in Tacoma under my business name, moved what mattered across 3 trips in my truck, early mornings when Sandra was still sleeping, books, 1 good set of cookware, my grandfather's watch collection, the external hard drive with 20 years of project files. Week 8, a Thursday morning in June, I left a letter on the kitchen counter. Not long. 4 paragraphs. I told Sandra I was not coming back, that I had made arrangements ensuring her financial stability through the end of our legal separation process, that my attorney would be in touch, and that I wished her well with sincerity and without performance. I did not mention Kayla. I did not mention the chat. I put my house key next to the letter, walked to my truck, drove away. She called 37 times between 8 a.m. and noon. I know because I counted them later, scrolling through the missed calls with the focused detachment of someone reading a weather report for a city they no longer live in. What surprised me was what happened next, or rather what didn't happen. Sandra's version of events, which I learned about through Derek's wife Andrea, who remained neutral but not silent, was that I'd had a breakdown. The stress of a large project had caught up with me. I'd always been emotionally unavailable, she told people, and this was the inevitable result. She described me to her book club as someone who processed everything through work and had never learned to be present in a relationship. It was elegant, I'll admit. By making me the one who'd fractured, she made herself the one who'd endured. She'd stood by me for years while I prioritized contracts over connection. She was not a woman who'd systematically excluded her husband from his own family. She was a woman who'd been left by a man who couldn't cope. Kayla believed her. Why wouldn't she? She was 25, in her first year of law school, under real pressure, and the parent she'd been confiding in for years was telling a coherent story. I didn't call Kayla to correct the record. That wasn't the move. When you know a narrative is wrong, you don't argue with it, you build a better one. The Tacoma apartment served its purpose for 4 months. I worked. Slept well for the first time in years, which told me something I hadn't wanted to know about what sleeping in that house had been costing me. I ran in the mornings along the waterfront. Ate well, called Owen twice a week, which was more than I'd ever allowed myself before. It was Owen who introduced me to Claire. She was a structural engineer who'd left a corporate firm to start her own practice specializing in adaptive reuse projects, which meant she spent her days figuring out how to take things that looked beyond saving and find the bones worth building around. We met at a conference on sustainable development in Seattle in October. She laughed at a joke I made about load-bearing walls as a metaphor for marriage, a joke I hadn't planned to make out loud, and said, "You know, most people at these things think metaphors are above their pay grade." I liked her immediately and did nothing about it for 3 months, because I was still legally married and I'm not built for overlap. In January, Philip finalized the separation agreement. Sandra got the house, a fair settlement, and health coverage through the end of the calendar year. She did not get access to the Coastal Meridian Trust. Her attorney had tried. Philip had been pleasantly immovable. In February, I called Claire. We were careful with each other in the way that people who've both been through something are careful. No rushing. No performing. We had dinner, then another dinner, then a weekend in the Olympic Peninsula where we talked for 11 hours straight and then were quiet together in a way that felt like relief. I told her about Owen the third time we met. Showed her a photo. She asked good questions and then moved on without making it strange. I told her about Sandra and Kayla in the chat and the letter. She listened without editorializing, which is rarer than people think. By spring, I had moved into a house in West Seattle. With a view of the Sound and a garage, I converted into a drafting studio. Owen visited twice. On his second visit, Claire was there, and the three of them ended up making dinner together while I sat at the kitchen table pretending to read and actually watching the people I cared about occupy the same space without anyone performing anything. That was, quietly, one of the best evenings of my life. Meanwhile, Kayla was finishing her second year of law school. Through Derek, through mutual family connections I kept tabs on without reaching out, I knew she was doing well academically. I knew she'd been named to the law review. I knew she'd started seeing someone, a second-year PhD candidate in environmental policy named James. I also knew, from the trust documents Philip had drawn up, that Kayla had a substantial inheritance waiting for her on the other side of specific conditions. Completion of her law degree, 1 year of independent employment, 18 months of financial independence from Sandra. The conditions weren't punitive. They were designed to ensure that what I gave her would mean something, that she'd receive it as a person who'd built her own ground to stand on. She didn't know any of that yet. The call came on a Tuesday in May, her third year of law school. It was 6:14 in the morning. I was already awake. Dad. She'd called me Dad. Not Marcus, not the slightly distanced hey that I'd gotten used to before I left. I said her name. She started crying before she could finish her first sentence. What came out in pieces, between the kind of crying that has clearly been building for a while, was this: she had gotten an offer from a firm she wanted. A real one. Environmental litigation, Seattle-based, starting in September. She'd called Sandra first to share the news, and Sandra had immediately pivoted to logistics, to what it meant for Sandra's own plans to move closer to Kayla after graduation, to which neighborhoods would work best, to a conversation that had apparently lasted 45 minutes and had never once simply said, "I'm proud of you." And Kayla had hung up and sat in her apartment at 6 in the morning and realized she wanted to call her father. I said, "I'm proud of you." She cried harder. We talked for an hour, about the firm, about James, about what she wanted her life to look like. At some point she said, "I know things were bad before you left. I know I wasn't." She paused. "I know I wasn't fair to you. I think I was following Mom's lead and I didn't ask myself whether it was right. I didn't perform forgiveness. I didn't lecture." I said, "I know. And I think you're finding your own way now. That's what matters." She asked if she could see me. I said yes. We met for lunch the following Saturday at a waterfront restaurant in Seattle. She was nervous walking in, searching my face for something I couldn't name. I stood up when she came through the door, and she walked straight into a hug that lasted longer than hugs usually do when you've been estranged from someone. James was with her. He shook my hand with the kind of straightforward eye contact that tells you immediately whether someone means it, and he meant it. He'd heard about me. She'd told him the real version, and he had the grace not to make that obvious. Over lunch, Kayla mentioned almost carefully that her graduation ceremony was in 3 weeks. She didn't ask. She let the information sit in the air between us. I said, "I'd like to come, if that's an invitation." She said, "It is." Then she said, "It is." Then she said, "Mom will be there." "I know," I said. "Is that okay?" "I've had 3 years," I told her. "I'm okay." What I didn't tell her yet was everything else. I wanted her to have her graduation without the weight of financial revelations. I wanted that day to be about what she'd earned. The morning of the ceremony was clear and cool, the kind of Seattle morning that reminds you why people stay despite the winters. I wore a charcoal suit I'd bought for the occasion. Claire had vetoed 3 ties before approving the 4th, a deep green that she said was exactly right without explaining why, and she was correct. Owen flew in from Boise the night before. He was 31 now, a little gray at his temples, composed in the way of someone who's built his own life without anyone handing him the materials. We had dinner together the night before the graduation, the 3 of us. And I looked at my son across the table and felt the particular satisfaction of watching someone you helped become themselves, even from a careful distance. The ceremony was at Meany Hall. We arrived early. Owen found seats near the center, while I waited near the back, watching the families file in. Sandra arrived with her sister Patricia and two women I recognized from her book club. She was wearing a blue blazer and the particular expression of someone who is staging composure for an audience. She didn't see me at first. When she did, she stopped walking. I nodded. She said nothing. Her sister touched her arm, and they moved toward the seats they'd found. Owen raised an eyebrow when I sat down next to him. "How was that?" "Fine," I said, and I meant it. Kayla walked across that stage in a way I will remember for the rest of my life. Not because of the ceremony or the hood or the applause. Because right before she reached the dean, she looked out at the audience, and she found me, and she smiled. Not a public smile. The real one. The one I remembered from when she was 9 years old, and she'd finally solved a puzzle she'd been working on for days. I held it together. Owen did not. He wiped his eye with the absolute minimum acceptable motion and pretended he had not. After the ceremony, families gathered on the lawn outside. Kayla came through the crowd with James at her side, still in her gown, and she hugged me in the middle of the noise and the cameras and the scattered applause of other families doing the same thing. Sandra appeared while we were still standing together. She looked at me, then at Owen beside me. Owen, in his gray-templed composure, smiled pleasantly and extended his hand. "Owen Webb," he said. "Marcus's son." Sandra's expression shifted through several things very quickly. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was careful. "This is—" She paused. She didn't know how to construct the sentence. "This is Owen," I said. "We've been close for 15 years. You never asked about him, so I never explained him. But he's here now, and he's not going anywhere." Kayla looked at Owen, then at me, then at Owen again. She said quietly, "I have a brother. A half-brother," Owen said gently. "But I prefer just brother if that's all right with you." James put a steadying hand on Kayla's back. She looked like she needed a moment, and she took it, which is one of the things I respected most about my daughter. Sandra said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because you told me on our second date that my life before you was ancient history and you only cared about now. I took you at your word. That was my mistake, probably. But it was yours first." Her sister stepped closer. Sandra's jaw tightened. "This is not the place," Sandra said. "I agree," I said. "It isn't. It never will be, for most of what there is to say. Philip has my contact. Anything that needs addressing, that's where it goes." I turned back to Kayla. "There's something I'd like to explain to you," I said, "when you have time. About some plans I made for you. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. Just something you should know." She nodded. She was still processing Owen's existence, I could see it. But she was also still herself, still the person who'd earned that gown. And she was managing it with more grace than her mother was. Later that afternoon, the 5 of us, me, Claire, Owen, Kayla, and James, sat at a long table at a restaurant in Capitol Hill that James had reserved weeks earlier with cheerful preemptive confidence. Owen told a story about a project he'd worked on in Nevada that had gone comically sideways in a way that cost no one anything and ended with everyone involved becoming friends. Claire told a story about a renovation where they'd opened a wall expecting insulation and found a complete 1940s kitchen behind it. Dishes still in the cabinet. Kayla laughed with the specific freedom of someone who has been holding tension in her shoulders for a long time and finally put it down. At one point, without announcement, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Just for a second. Then she went back to her food. That was enough. 2 weeks later, I met Kayla for coffee. Owen had flown home. Claire had tactfully scheduled a site visit that morning, giving us space. I brought the trust documents. Philip had summarized the key points in plain language, which is the only language worth using when you're trying to make something clear. I explained the conditions. Completed degree, which she'd done. 1 year of independent employment, which she was about to begin. 18 months of financial self-sufficiency, which would require only that she not ask me or Sandra to cover her bills. She sat with it for a moment. "You set this up while you were still with Mom." 5 years ago, I said. "Before things got bad. I always believed you'd build your own life. I just wanted to make sure what I gave you would land in hands that knew what to do with it." She looked at the numbers on the summary page. She looked back up. "Dad, this is—" She stopped. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just do the work you're already going to do. It'll be here when the time is right." She asked about Owen's stake in the trust. I told her. She asked if Owen and I were close. "Very," I said. "We'd managed it carefully over the years, kept things separate when separate was what the situation required. But he'd never been secret to me, only private. There's a difference. She said, I'd like to get to know him, if that's okay with both of you. I said I'd already spoken to him about it, actually. He felt the same way. She laughed, a small sound. You're always already 3 steps ahead. Occupational habit, I said. We sat there finishing our coffee without hurrying, watching the street outside, people passing with their ordinary mornings. And I thought about what it meant to build something that holds, how the invisible work, the rebar inside the concrete, the drainage systems under the foundation, the load calculations that nobody ever sees. That's what determines whether a structure survives the weight placed on it over time. I built invisible things for a long time in my marriage. In the end, they hadn't been enough to save it because the structure above them wasn't worth saving. But they were enough to protect what mattered. 8 months later, Kayla passed the Washington State bar exam on her first attempt. I found out from James, who sent me a text at 7 in the morning containing only her score and 2 words. She crushed it. I sent her flowers with a card that said exactly what I felt, which was that she had done every part of this herself, and that watching it happen had been one of the privileges of my life. She called me that evening. We talked for 2 hours. About the firm, about a pro bono case she'd already been assigned, about James's dissertation defense coming up in the spring. At some point she said, I've been thinking about what Mom said, back when this all started. That you were never really present, that you processed everything through work. She paused. I think what she meant, Kayla continued, was that you weren't performing presence the way she wanted you to. But you were there. You were just there in your own way. Quietly. I think I misread that for a long time. I said, I think you read it the way you were given information to read it. Yeah, she said. I don't blame you for that, I told her. You were 22, 23. You were figuring out who you were, and she was the one in the room. I know. But I want to do better. I'm trying to do better. I'm trying to do better. That's all any of us can do, I said. Sandra called once in the fall. A Sunday evening, which told me it wasn't about logistics. I let it go to voicemail. She said she'd been thinking, and there were things she wished she'd handled differently, and if I ever wanted to talk, she was open to it. Her voice was measured, careful, the voice of someone who has rehearsed. I don't think she was insincere. I think she meant it in the way people mean things, when the outcome is already clarified for them what they should have valued earlier. I didn't call back. Some conversations only have a right time, and that time was years behind us. What was ahead of us was a daughter we both loved who was building something worth being proud of. That was the thread we shared now. It was enough. Claire and I got married the following June. A small ceremony in the backyard of a house we'd bought together in Edmonds, on a bluff above the Sound. 14 people. Owen was my best man. Kayla stood up with Claire's sister. James gave a toast that was funny and warm and exactly the right length, which made me like him even more than I already did. There was a moment, late in the afternoon, when the light was doing what light does over water in the Pacific Northwest in June. That soft horizontal gold that doesn't exist anywhere else. When I looked around at the people in that backyard and understood something, I had not rebuilt my life after losing it. I had built a different life, one that had been waiting in the structural plans all along. The one that became possible once I stopped propping up something that was designed to hold only one kind of weight. Mine. Kayla found me near the garden, and we stood together for a moment without talking, which was something we'd learned to do in the past 2 years. Just standing in the same place, watching the same thing. She said, I'm glad you're happy. I said, I'm glad you're happy. I said, I'm glad you're here. She leaned her head briefly against my shoulder, the way she used to when she was small, and the world was a lot less complicated. And then she straightened up and went back to find James. The sound was doing something remarkable with the light. Owen came to stand beside me and handed me a glass of something cold. We stood there for a while, my son and I, not saying much, watching the water, which is something good. Structures are built to do. Hold the weight and let the view take care of the rest.